quantum computing, quantum algorithms, quantum supremacy. Those things sound cool, but what do they actually mean? Today's guest answers that question and many more. Dr. Jan Goetz is one of Europe's lead figures in the quantum computing industry. He's the CEO and co-founder of IQM, a pan-European company that integrates quantum computers into research labs and data centers, and has raised over 71 million euros. He's also a board member of the European Innovation Council, and we talk a little bit about the ups and downs of the innovation scene here in Europe. If you're new to the Utopian podcast, welcome. Please consider following the UPod on whichever platform you're using and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to check out my website at theutopian.blog for more. So, Jan, thanks for joining us today. Even though quantum computing is talked about a lot in the tech and science world and has a huge potential impact on all sorts of industries, it can be a pretty tough thing to grasp. So we'll start at square one. What's the difference between a normal computer and a quantum computer?
Well, the difference is kind of deep in the heart of the computer, but maybe it's good to always start what they have in common. And this is that both of them are machines that compute something. So you have a problem that you can put into some kind of code or software, and then you run this software on the computer and you get the result out in the end. And this is what both of the systems do. A classical computer solves your problems, and also a quantum computer solves your problems. So it's a piece of hardware where you can run an algorithm on. And the clue is that for certain algorithms, the quantum computer can be just much faster than any classical computer that we have. And this allows us to solve problems which otherwise would never be solvable with classical computers. So this is the promise of quantum computers, that they really solve you problems that otherwise you will never get the answer to. And the way they do it, that they find shortcuts in solving the problems. And the shortcuts, they can be so strong that, let's say, if you have the biggest supercomputer on Earth, it would need thousands of years to solve a problem. And the quantum computer could do this in a matter of minutes, or let's say seconds. So it's really kind of these orders of magnitude. And the shortcuts, they appear in the quantum world. So this is where the word quantum comes from, quantum computer, that they are not based on the laws of classical physics, but we can enter a quantum regime where the physical laws are somewhat different. And this regime, for example, it appears when you look at individual atoms or individual electrons or other particles like light particles. And then if you have these kind of individual particles, they show these quantum effects. And this is, in a sense, also what happens in the quantum computer, is that we build systems where we can have individual either particles or other kind of excitations, and we use them actually to compute. Then, since they follow the quantum mechanical laws, they can take these shortcuts. So we can build algorithms to implement on those quantum systems, and those then can be run and provide the results much faster. And how to build such a system, there are still actually different ways to implement it from the hardware perspective. The approach that we are doing with our company, but that also quite a few others are doing, are so-called superconducting circuits. So these are chips very similar to a normal computer chip that you have in your laptop or so. So you have these electrical circuits on a piece of silicon, and you cool it down, and then these quantum phenomena emerge. But there are also other technologies. For example, you can trap individual atoms or ions or so. But basically, it's a piece of hardware where you can run an algorithm on, and then for certain algorithms, the computational times is just order of magnitude shorter, and this is where the promise comes from.
Of course, this is a very nascent technology, and it's facing a lot of technical issues, as I'm sure you're well aware. And some of those issues are highlighted in the difference of definition between physical and logical qubits. And we didn't actually touch upon the idea of qubits. So could you start with defining qubit and then defining the difference between physical and logical qubits?
So usually in a classical computer, you have bits, which, for example, you can realize through transistors or so. And this is where the information is stored. You can either store a 0 or a 1 in a classical bit. And in the quantum world, so this is one of the quantum resources that we use, which is called superposition. So these quantum bits, they can be in a superposition state between 0 and 1. So one way to imagine, for example, a qubit is if you have an electrical circuit and you can store an excitation in there. And with excitation here, I mean a package of energy. So then you can either have the energy stored in there or not. This would be classical 0 and 1. But if you kind of go into the quantum regime, there is the superposition. So at the same time, the excitation is there and not. And only if you look, you will find out if it was there or not. So one person, a very famous physicist, has tried to explain this through the Schrödinger cat example. So there is the kind of box with a cat and then some radioactive source. And only if you open the box, you will see actually if the cat is still alive or if it's dead. So this is superposition. This is one of the resources. So each qubit can be in a superposition of being 0 and 1. But then there is a second very important ingredient, which is called entanglement. So if you have 2 of such qubits, for example, you can entangle them, which means they actually share the same information. And they cannot be viewed as separate entities anymore, but they always have to be described together because they really share the information. So one qubit always knows about the information of the other one and vice versa. And then in a sense, the computational power comes that by adding a qubit to it, let's say a third one, you again double the computational space. So basically you have 8 computational levels with 3. And then if you have 4, again, you double it. So you have this kind of exponential law. And this is where the compute power comes from. However, having said that, is that one kind of challenge in the quantum world is that these systems are super fragile. Yeah, so the kind of the fragility of the qubits is a problem because it creates errors. So they lose information over time, and this means in the algorithms that you run, you make mistakes or errors, and this means your result is not reliable. And this is of course a problem, but it's not a fundamental problem. So to overcome this, there is a technique called error correction. And this, in a simple way, works so that you can actually, from the outside, detect those errors. And then whenever an error happened, you can correct for it in real time, so to say. So this is the technique that you can apply to avoid those errors. This kind of is the transition from a physical qubit, so a single, let's say, transistor-like implementation, a single piece on your chip, and a logical qubit, which is then, in a sense, it's just many qubits bundled together and they correct each other. So there is let's say, a physical overhead in the number of qubits that you need. So for each logical qubit, for each bundle, you need maybe 100 or 1,000 physical qubits, and they together, they correct themselves, and then the information is kind of safe and secured for a long time. And this is a technological challenge that you have, because you need, in a sense, build very large quantum processors, which have many of those qubits on it. And at the moment, just to give you a feeling, I think the largest number that's reported today is from IBM is 127 qubits. So maybe with those, you could build one error-corrected qubit or so, but then with one logical qubit, you cannot really do a lot of calculations because it's only one piece of information. So this is the kind of challenge that you have. But actually, there is also another opportunity for kind of making intermediate solutions, which is kind of just accepting the errors and trying to run algorithms which kind of live with the errors. This is what people call noisy. Like noisy means there's a lot of noise or errors in the systems. Noisy intermediate scale quantum computers. So NISQ is the abbreviation for it. And this is kind of the strategy that many companies have, that they say, okay, as long as we don't have these super large processors with let's say hundreds of thousands of physical qubits, we will run these noisy algorithms and still create benefit then for the customer.
Yeah, and there's also this idea of quantum supremacy, or what's sometimes called quantum advantage. How can we understand and think about that?
Yeah, so these words sometimes they're kind of used interchangeably, but actually some people do some differentiate between those two words that you mentioned, quantum supremacy and quantum advantage. And actually, I also follow this notation where, for me, quantum supremacy means that you run an algorithm on a quantum computer, and with this you outperform any classical supercomputer in the world. But it doesn't mean that the algorithm really adds a lot of value or there's usefulness behind it. It can be a kind of mathematical construction. And then quantum advantage, it brings this usefulness in addition. So it's basically an additional requirement that you say, okay, you have supremacy. So you have the fact that you outperform any classical computer, but you do this for a meaningful algorithm that adds value. And what was reported by the Google team already some time ago was this quantum supremacy experiment where they were running an algorithm on their processor in a few hundred seconds. And back then, the claim was that with the largest supercomputer, I think they estimated 10,000 years. Meanwhile, there have been a few other improvements also on the classical algorithm side, and the time scales are not that long anymore. But nevertheless, so this is kind of state of the art, let's say. So we are right at the threshold with the best quantum processors of what can be simulated classically. So the field now is working on the one hand, of course, of still increasing the processor size, making them more powerful, but then, of course, also very heavily on the algorithm and application side to identify those algorithms that you can run on these kind of intermediate scale processors, which actually bring value from an industrial perspective, for example.
Yeah. And I was also wondering if you see there being a Moore's law equivalent, so to speak, of the quantum computing industry. And we saw IBM not too long ago, like announce their plan to have Condor, which is I think 1,000 qubit quantum computer by the end of 2023. Will we also see an exponential increase in the number of qubits or other metrics? And like, what are the main factors that could potentially block that scalability?
Yeah, that's a good point. So, I mean, for the thing is that the number of qubits, if you then relate back to kind of classical computers, there already the computational power, it scales in this more or less exponential way. Of course, you always have some overhead, maybe from error correction, but nevertheless, so if the number of qubits doubles, it means more to the computational power than it means for the classical computers when the number of bits doubles because of this kind of exponential dependence that you already have there. But I think in the end, if you look at how benchmarks are being done nowadays for classical computers, it's not so much anymore counting the number of transistors or whatever, but it's really kind of measuring the time it takes you to perform a certain algorithm. Because also what we see in the classical computing world is that some algorithms actually they perform better on, let's say, CPUs. Other ones perform better on graphical processing units, GPUs, especially, for example, in the AI field or so. Also, for what we see is that, for example, for some mining applications, you build these application-specific computers or so. So I think in the end, what matters is how fast can your system solve a certain problem, and this can be a good metric, because also, as said, there are still different hardware platforms and they have different properties, different pros and cons. So it's not so easy actually to compare in between the different platforms. So this is why I think on the long run, the fairest way to really compare different systems is just to check, okay, how long does this system to solve the problem and how long does the other one need to solve the problem?
Yeah. And now I do want to pivot a little bit towards like the applications of quantum computers. And so I've heard the analogy that quantum computing is now where AI was in the 2000s, where the real benefits of using it are in sort of very narrow applications, similar to the term narrow AI, such as like making one small step of a computational process a little quicker, cheaper, or more accurate. And then my question is, what are some of those narrow applications of quantum computing that are drawing interest nowadays?
Yeah, I think it's a fair comparison. And of course, one can always debate what is the exact time like you're referring to it, because AI exists already for a long time also. And it was mainly then hardware enabled, I would say. And also, this is something that you can compare to quantum. At the moment, the hardware is just not powerful enough to run the algorithms that are there. But the idea is to come back to your question for those algorithms. There are manifold. So there are generally, I think, almost every industry you find an application where quantum computers might help. But the question is kind of how big of a processor do you need? And for me, I make there a distinction between two cases. The first case is you have a problem where already you're happy if you're executing the algorithm just a little bit faster than with whatever is out there. Let's say if you are a bank and you do some option pricing or so, it's already helpful for you if you outperform your competition just by a little bit. So it's not order of kind of magnitudes in the time scale, but it's really just gaining a little bit. So this is one class. And the other one is where you really enable those problems where otherwise the time scales would not be like human time scales, but would be thousands or millions of years. So you really enable the solution of a problem that otherwise cannot be solved. Of course, there is a lot of value in those ones because this, in a sense, creates completely new markets, new applications. It's disruptive, whereas the first one is just kind of adding you a little bit of value. But the applications, I already mentioned the finance part. So many applications actually have an optimization background because quantum computers, the algorithms, there are quite a few which come from this kind of optimization side, which relates to, let's say, the complexity classes. So these are, let's say, so-called traveling salesman problems, and there also you kind of optimize the route on the map. Another thing, of course, that always fits is, and this goes more towards the simulation, that actually you use the quantum computer to compute something on the quantum side. So, and this goes back to the very heart of the idea of quantum, which was formulated by Richard Feynman, I think in the 80s, early 80s already, where he was saying that nature isn't classical, but kind of at the microscopic level, nature follows quantum mechanics. So you better use a quantum system to simulate nature. And I think he didn't use the word quantum computer back then, but this was kind of the birth of the idea. And there are many applications related to this. So for example, if you think about material science, where you want to simulate certain properties of a crystal or any other kind of material, let's say solar cells or other functional materials, but then also more on the molecular side, and this can go into pharmaceuticals or others, where you really want to understand the properties of large molecules. This is very hard to simulate on classical computers, and there the quantum computers are promising to solve those problems, where maybe the analogy can be understood in a more straightforward way, because you use a quantum system, a quantum processor, to actually simulate or emulate another quantum system, which is the molecule or whatever you kind of try to simulate.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And one other application area of modern quantum computing is so-called quantum communication. And I know IQM isn't directly involved in this field, but I was wondering if you could still explain this application and maybe give some thoughts on where it might be headed in the future.
Yeah, that's a good point. So actually, quantum technologies, let's say, it has several pillars, and quantum computing is only one of them. It's the, let's say, most widely known ones because of the big promises that it makes. But there are at least two other relevant ones, and one is quantum communication. The third one is quantum sensing. So quantum sensing, basically, the idea is you use quantum sensors, so sensors to detect, for example, very small magnetic fields or changes in magnetic fields that you can use for brain imaging or things like that. But then quantum communication means that you use quantum states for secure communication. This actually is already being done. For example, the Chinese, they send out satellites into the atmosphere, and then they use quantum signals to communicate. And it has a security aspect because it's not so easy then anymore to steal the information, because the sender and observer kind of, they realize if someone is listening in. But the big vision that people have is to combine all of those and build something like a quantum internet or so at some point. So locally you have compute nodes, quantum computers, and then they are connected by quantum communication channels. So in this sense, you kind of combine all of this. So this is kind of the big vision. But of course, we are still quite some steps away from this. So at the moment, people more or less work on the individual pieces, so either on the quantum computers or on the quantum communication. But actually, there are already first academic efforts to combine those and, for example, build then interfaces between communication and compute units.
Yeah, and I've emphasized this trend in the past, but now some of the innovations that we're hitting in tech are way beyond like mobile apps and social media. Like these are innovations what are usually called deep tech, and they're paradigm shifting, that are intertwined with science both on the development as well as the application side. And of course, they have enormous economic as well as political importance. And Jan, you're a board member also of the European Innovation Council, and so have a lot of exposure to the public sector. And so from that perspective, what role does quantum computing play in geopolitical competition between various governments and government-funded private entities, like racing to build more effective quantum computers?
Yeah, it is a big topic, mainly because there are, as already mentioned, certain security aspects. So not only on the communication side, also on the computing side, for example, there are algorithms that if you are running them on a large-scale quantum computer, they would allow you to break certain encryption codes, for example. But then also other applications, they might just kind of for the economy be so important that you just want to have the technology to run them to make sure that your economy stays competitive, for example. And this makes it a very big strategic topics to the different governments. And what we see at the moment is that, in a sense, every, let's say, country or at least region, if we say Europe as a region, wants to stay competitive on the technology side. So they don't want to lose the race and want to become dependent then on other nations or so. And this is why people put a lot of money into the field, but also think about the right strategy on how to actually implement those plans. Because as you said, it needs to be an interplay between the scientific world, the academics, the universities, but then also spin-outs, established companies, if you want to build a complete industry around this, which you need if you want to be kind of competitive on a global scale. So what we, for example, do in this European Innovation Council is to think about what is necessary on the funding side, on the regulatory side, all of this, to make sure that in Europe we have the right measures in place that we keep competitive on the different technologies that are relevant. So quantum, of course, is only one of them. There are way more space and other compute technologies and so on. But this is what we do. And I think this is very important because it's, in a sense, the future. So also if we think about having attractive jobs, making sure that kind of people stay in Europe or come back to Europe to work, all of these things, having the supply chains in place. So there are quite many topics related to this, where it's just important that kind of people look at it from a holistic point of view, and that the right also then funding instruments, for example, are in place to make sure that we are able to compete globally with those technologies. So this is, in a sense, what we are doing there. And the investments into deep tech, I mean, they're constantly increasing, which I think is a good thing. So with the EIC alone, we are kind of having, I think, 10 billion euro in Europe to contribute for the next couple of years and into this field, which is quite a lot of money. But of course, then, as said, one needs to have the right plans in place on how to distribute and use the money so that really good things come out of it.
So you think that this geopolitical competition has actually helped boost the development of quantum computers and the industry as a whole?
At least it has led to more money. And of course, money doesn't solve all the problems, but it can help with many problems. In the end, in technology, especially in these deep tech fields, what you need is the best people, because you need to have these innovative ideas. Still, you need some disruptive ideas. So money, of course, can help to a certain extent to get people in, but also it can help, for example, to get infrastructure in place. So, for example, if you think about building computers, this is something that is a super hot topic these days because we have this global shortage on the, for example, chip supply chain for classical chips. And now, for example, people are also thinking, okay, if we are now building foundries for classical chips, can we also have similar plans then for the quantum industry to make sure that this is what I meant with supply chain, that we have all the infrastructure in place to actually be able to build also such systems and produce them maybe later at a larger scale. And in this sense, this geopolitical situation has helped because money or the related programs, they have been put in place. And then, of course, what you need is the people. But I think there we have actually a very good positioning in Europe because we have very good university. We have a very good educational system. What we are missing is somehow the kind of transformation out of universities then into science and then into deep tech companies. And then also what we're missing is the follow-up step of kind of, if you have created such deep tech startups, helping them to grow into big companies. So if you look at how the money is spent in Europe in terms of funding into startups, Europe spends a lot of money in the early stages, so seed stage startups or maybe the first A round or so. But then when it comes to scaling the companies, actually Europe is not anymore leading. And I think, for example, this is something we should change if we want to have at least companies that are of the size of Facebook, Google, or any of the others you mentioned. I think we have to be much more active also in the scale-up phase, in this later stage funding phases.
And do you think that that later stage funding could come from or should come from government or private VC?
Well, that's a tricky question. So what we try with the EIC is to bridge what people call the funding gap. So usually in deep tech, the challenge is that there is very long kind of R&D roadmaps still involved until you have a product, which can be, I don't know, several years. And you, of course, you need to kind of be funded throughout the time. Sometimes then the early stage VCs, for them, it's already too expensive or whatever, so they don't really want to fund anymore. But then the growth funds, they are missing the revenue part because it's deep tech, you're not really making so much revenue. So this is this kind of funding gap. And what this EIC, for example, has a program, it's called EIC Accelerator, where the companies get a grant plus an equity component. And this is specially designed so that it can kind of bridge this gap so that the companies can survive until the product is ready and they can make revenues, and then the scale-up funds can kick in. And of course, it is kind of public money, so the EIC becomes a shareholder of those companies, and people have different opinions for it. And but my opinion still is that before the companies kind of die because no one wants to fund them anymore, but they have a very disruptive technology, I think it's a very good instrument to bridge this gap.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to touch on a point that you mentioned earlier a little bit again, which is the chip shortage. I mean, it's an issue that's affecting pretty much the whole tech industry. And here in Europe, everybody wants to place contracts with the manufacturing facility in Dresden. And it's booked out until 2026. And I was just wondering, is the chip shortage here in Europe or in general, is it posing a problem for the development of quantum computers?
Yeah, so just to be clear, of course, one always has here to differentiate between then the classical chips that you were talking about and the quantum chips that we are building, the quantum processors. But actually also for the quantum processors that we use, we need a lot of classical electronics to control them. And of course, there we also experience the chip shortage. So things get more expensive, things have very long lead times, more than a year or almost 2 years in some cases. And this, of course, it is slowing down the development. In this sense, I think, as you said, everyone is affected. And the problem then, especially, let's say, for the deep tech world is that we don't have the volumes. So we cannot go and say, okay, we order kind of millions of chips, because this is not what we are operating at. So we have usually very small volumes. So we have very little kind of negotiation power. And we are, in this sense, I would say the startups, they are suffering quite a lot from this. And one way around it, what you can do, of course, as a startup is try to get, for example, strategic investments in from some of those companies which produce the chips, and then you can get some advantage. So this is one way around it. Or also what also could help is that you do kind of R&D work together with them, and then you say, okay, we develop new kind of chipsets, and then you get the material through this. But other than that, I think startups suffer from the same pain that everyone else is suffering from, that basically it's very hard to get microprocessors and these things at the moment.
And to pivot a little bit, one common concern that everybody has, or many people have, about quantum computing, it relates to cybersecurity. If a quantum computer is so much stronger than a classical one, is there a threat of them, cracking cryptographic security and things like bank transfers, data transfers, or even cryptocurrency protocols?
Yeah, I already mentioned this a little bit. So also for the computing side, there is this kind of security aspect. And what people mean with this is that there is a known algorithm, the so-called Shor algorithm, which can be used to factorize large numbers. So if you have a large number, actually it's not so easy to find out the prime numbers, that if you multiply all of them, they result in this number. And this asymmetry, it's easy to multiply the numbers if you know them and get the large number, but the reverse is not easy. And this asymmetry is used in the encryption scheme. So if you had a large quantum computer, you could break basically the encryption schemes that are based on this factorization, which, for example, I think is the RSA, or maybe the most widely used one. But the thing is, there are so-called quantum safe encryption codes. So there are encryption methods which cannot be cracked then anymore by the quantum computers. So the task basically for the community is to change all the encryption codes into any quantum safe code before we have a large-scale quantum computer. So it's a time scale and money problem, because it costs money and time to change it. You have to do this basically for all the data that was stored with the RSA or any kind of encryption codes, because also in reverse, of course, you can then decrypt them. So it's not so that often you read this, that quantum computers, they can break all encryption codes. This is wrong. They can break some encryption codes, but this is not a fundamental problem. It's just a kind of problem of how much are we willing to invest to change our current encryption codes.
Okay, we're almost done. Final question. We're already past the halfway mark of the first month of 2022. And I'm curious to know if you have any major milestones for IQM or the quantum computing industry as a whole that you're looking out for in this new year and beyond. It could be benchmarks of qubits or new announcements, or what are you looking for?
The whole field, of course, is looking for this. What I mentioned in the beginning is called quantum advantage. So have a quantum computer that can run a meaningful problem. I don't think we will see this in 2022. So this would be more like a breakthrough that I see for the next couple of years. It's really hard to say when exactly we hit this, but I think this is kind of the goal that the whole field is working for. We at IQM, we have a very pragmatic approach that we say, okay, we have small scale processors now. So for example, at the moment, we are operating a 5-qubit system, and we have, let's say, state-of-the-art specs for it in terms of how good the gate operations are and the lifetimes are. And then what we do is we will release new processor generations almost on an annual basis. So what we are now working on is the 20-qubit chip to take this into operation. For us, this will be the big milestone now for 2022 to kind of get the 20-qubit chip out and working, and then also deliver it to our customers. So our business model actually is that we sell the systems, and one of our customers is VTT, a research center in Finland, and they will get a 20-qubit quantum system from us. So these are the big milestones that we are looking for IQM.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'll keep an eye out for it. And I'm really excited to see where this whole industry and IQM goes in the years to come. So what's the best way that people can get in contact with you?
Well, we have a webpage and social media accounts, so just follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and reach out to our contact addresses on the webpage if you have an kind of question, or also go to our careers page. So we're always looking for very good people to join us. We are constantly growing in all the locations. So we are working from Finland, but then also Munich, Paris, Spain. So if you're interested in any of those, just check out our careers page and submit an application.
Great, Jan. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I wish you success with IQM.
Well, thanks. It was really a pleasure talking to you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the UPod. If you did, please give a like if you're on YouTube, and follow the UPod on whichever platform you prefer. That's Spotify, Google Podcasts, or Apple Podcasts. If you want to learn more, go to www.theutopian.blog and join my newsletter. I also share exclusive interview highlights, infographics, and community events which you can join all on my Instagram at the.utopian.blog and on my LinkedIn page, The Utopian. I'm always open to being messaged on any of those platforms if you ever want to get in touch. I really appreciate your support, and I hope to see you next time.